21 days of silence is a slow-acting poison, and tonight, Saphira Luxe was done being the victim of it. She stood before the vanity mirror, the cool weight of diamond jewelry resting against her skin like cold iron shackles. For 3 weeks, this penthouse, this glass-walled monument to Lee Seo-Jin's power, had become a mausoleum of unspoken words. Each room echoed with the phantom sounds of the conversations they weren't having. Her husband, the man who commanded the city's most feared shipping empire, had perfected the art of existing in her space without acknowledging her presence. It had been 21 days since the click of a door closing between them had sounded as final as a gunshot. Since then, Seo-Jin had exiled himself to the guest suite, leaving Saphira to haunt the corridors of their life like a ghost. Breakfasts were eaten in solitude, messages were delivered through stone-faced assistants, and on the rare occasion their paths crossed, he offered her only the cold, distant courtesy one might extend to a total stranger in an elevator. It was a slow psychological torture, but tonight, the silence would break. Saphira smoothed the fabric of her evening gown over her hips. She had chosen black, the color of shadows, of secrets, of a silent declaration of war. The dress was sleek, with a plunging neckline and a silhouette that fit like a second skin, designed specifically to be impossible to ignore. She wasn't just dressing for a gala, she was dressing to remind him exactly what he was trying to bury behind his walls of protection. She stepped out of the bedroom, her heels clicking against the polished marble with a deliberate, rhythmic precision that cut through the stillness of the foyer. Above her, the massive chandelier cast prismatic, fractured light across the grand staircase. Somewhere in the depths of the house, she could hear the low, dangerous murmur of Seo-Jin's voice, likely another encrypted phone call concerning the escalating tensions with the Bususan families. Then, abruptly, the voice stopped. Saphira was halfway down the stairs when she felt it, the heavy, physical weight of his gaze. She didn't look up, even as her fingers tightened instinctively on the gold-patterned banister. She kept her pace steady, her breathing controlled, ignoring the way her heart tried to hammer its way out of her chest. She reached the foyer, her hand moving toward the handle of the massive front door, when his voice finally sliced through the 3-week frost. "One more step toward that door and I'll remind this entire city why you're wearing my ring. Hey family, before this story begins, I want you to do something real quick. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Your comments fuel these stories. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button because what happens next will leave you speechless. And Happy New Year to every single one of you. Let's start this year with a story that will keep you glued till the very end." The tone was low, feral, and edged with a possessive rage she hadn't heard in nearly a month. Saphira paused, her hand hovering just inches from the handle, a slow, triumphant smile ghosting across her lips. The war had finally moved from the shadows into the light. The penthouse was a masterclass in architectural silence, a 5,000-square-foot expanse of glass and cold stone that felt less like a home and more like a high-end gallery for two people who had forgotten how to speak. Saphira stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the primary suite, looking out at the city lights of Seoul, which glittered like scattered diamonds she couldn't reach. Behind her, the room was a symphony of ivory silk and dark mahogany, every object placed with a precision that felt clinical rather than comfortable. This was the life she had once dreamed of, a world of absolute opulence where the floors were heated marble and the air was perfumed with expensive lilies, yet the atmosphere was heavy with the weight of 21 days of isolation. She moved through the master suite, her bare feet silent on the plush Persian rugs, tracing the edge of the dresser where Seo-Jin's watch collection sat in velvet-lined boxes. They were reminders of his time he no longer shared with her. The guest suite, located at the far end of the eastern wing, might as well have been in another country. He had retreated there the night after the click of a door had signaled the end of their peace, and since then, the silence had become a physical presence, a third inhabitant in their marriage. Saphira caught her reflection in a gold-framed mirror, noting how the shadows under her eyes were masked by the expert application of makeup. She was surrounded by the finest things money could buy, yet she felt like a ghost haunting her own hallways. The kitchen was a chef's dream of stainless steel and quartz, but it remained cold, the only signs of life being the single espresso cup Seo-Jin left behind each morning before vanishing to his office at dawn. There were no more shared breakfasts, no more lingering touches by the coffee machine, no more whispers of what the day would hold. The penthouse had become a gilded mausoleum where their love was being preserved in ice. Every piece of furniture, every piece of art, seemed to mock her with its permanence while her relationship felt as fragile as spun glass. She was trapped on the wrong side of the emotional walls Seo-Jin had constructed to keep her safe, not realizing that the distance was more dangerous than any rival mafia family could ever be. Tonight, however, the mausoleum would be desecrated. Saphira reached for the black silk gown draped over the chaise longue, her fingers tightening on the fabric. If Seo-Jin wanted a world of silence and shadows, she was about to give him a riot. Saphira returned to the vanity, her movements sharp with a purpose that had been missing for 21 agonizing days. The silence in the penthouse was no longer a weight she would passively carry, tonight, it would be the fuel for her fire. She sat before the mirror, the woman staring back looking far more lethal than she had only hours ago. Her reflection was a study in calculated defiance, every brushstroke of shadow and every line of kohl a preparation for the inevitable collision. Her fingers brushed against the fabric of the midnight black silk gown draped across the velvet chair. It was a masterpiece of subversion, a dress designed not for a party, but to start a war. While the penthouse was a museum of unspoken words, this dress was meant to be a shout in the dark. She stepped into it, the silk sliding against her skin with a cool, mocking touch that reminded her of the distance Seo-Jin had placed between them. As she pulled the zipper up, she felt the transformation complete. She was no longer a ghost haunting their halls, but a living, breathing provocation. She leaned in to apply a deep, dark pigment to her lips, a stark contrast to the diamond necklace that caught the light with every breath. These were the weapons of her choosing. Back when things were still warm between them, Seo-Jin would have been the one to linger at her spine, his hands helping with the clasp, his breath a low murmur against her neck as he found reasons to keep her from leaving. Now, she did it all herself, her movements precise and lonely. The gown fit like it had been painted on, every curve accentuated, every inch of fabric intended to remind him of exactly what he had been trying to ignore. It featured a plunging neckline and a slit that threatened to reveal too much with every step, a visual dare aimed directly at the man who had perfected the art of looking past her. Saphira stood and smoothed the silk over her hips, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs, not out of fear, but out of a desperate, primal need to be seen again. She wasn't just walking out of the house, she was walking through the walls he had built. She picked up her clutch and headed for the door, her heels ready to strike the marble floor like a countdown. The heavy double doors of the master suite clicked shut behind her, a sound that felt like the first shot of a revolution. Saphira stepped onto the landing, her heels striking the polished marble with a rhythmic, lethal precision that echoed through the vast, silent cavern of the foyer. The grand staircase curved below her like the spine of a sleeping beast, illuminated by the prismatic fractured light of the massive crystal chandelier overhead. She didn't rush, she moved with the deliberate grace of a woman who knew she was being watched, every step a calculated heartbeat. Halfway down the descent, the air in the penthouse shifted. The low, gravelly murmur of Lee Seo-Jin's voice, a sound that usually commanded empires and decided the fate of rival families, abruptly ceased. The sudden silence was more deafening than any shout. Saphira felt it before she saw him, the familiar, suffocating weight of his gaze. It was a physical touch, heavy and searing, tracing the line of her bare shoulders and the daring curve of the black silk that clung to her hips. For 21 days, she had been a ghost in these halls, but now, the intensity of his stare made her feel dangerously alive. Her fingers tightened instinctively on the gold-patterned banister, the cool metal a grounding contrast to the heat rising in her chest. She refused to give him the satisfaction of looking up. Instead, she kept her eyes fixed on the foyer below, her chin tilted at an angle of regal defiance. She could sense him now, a dark silhouette standing by the entrance to the eastern wing, his presence radiating a possessive, simmering energy that had been locked away for weeks. The distance between them felt like a live wire, humming with the tension of 1,000 unspoken accusations. Every click of her heels on the marble steps was a taunt, a reminder that she was no longer content to wait for him in the shadows. As she reached the final few steps, the air grew thick with the scent of his expensive cologne and the cold, sharp edge of his authority. She was merely feet away from the front door, her hand already reaching for the heavy brass handle, when the silence finally shattered. She didn't need to see his face to know the blank mask of the last 3 weeks had finally crumbled, replaced by the feral intensity of a man who realized his most precious possession was about to walk out into a city that didn't deserve to see her. Saphira's fingers were a mere inch from the heavy brass handle of the front door when the air in the foyer seemed to solidify. She didn't have to turn around to know he had moved. She could feel the sudden, suffocating proximity of his presence behind her, a shadow that loomed larger than the opulent walls surrounding them. The silence that had lasted for 21 days didn't just break, it shattered. "Where do you think you're going dressed like that?" His voice cut through the stillness like a blade. It was low, dangerous, and edged with a primal authority she hadn't heard in weeks. Saphira didn't flinch. She kept her back to him, her hand steady as it finally made contact with the cold metal of the door. The contact was a silent dare, a final provocation in the war she had started with a black silk dress. She heard the slow, deliberate scuff of his leather shoes against the marble, each step sounding like a countdown. He moved with the predatory grace of a man who was used to being the most dangerous person in any room. When he finally spoke again, he was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, a stark contrast to the icy distance he had maintained since their fight. "One more step toward that door and I'll remind this entire city why you're wearing my ring." The ultimatum hung in the air, vibrating with a possessive intensity that made the hair on her arms stand up. It wasn't just a threat, it was a reclamation. For 3 weeks, he had treated her like a stranger in an elevator, existing in the same space without a single word of acknowledgement. But tonight, the visual of her leaving, looking as dangerous and beautiful as she did, had snapped the iron control he had perfected. Saphira slowly turned her head, looking at him over her shoulder. His face, which had been absolutely blank for 21 days, was now a storm of simmering rage and raw, unfiltered need. The cold politeness was gone, replaced by the feral gaze of the Seo-Jin the world feared. Her fingers tightened on the handle, her heart hammering against her ribs like it was trying to escape. She had wanted him to look at her properly again, and now that he was, the sheer weight of his attention was almost enough to bring her to her knees. The silence was over, but the true confrontation was only just beginning. The heavy silence that had anchored the penthouse for 3 weeks didn't just break, it detonated. Saphira turned fully to face him, her black silk gown shimmering like oil on water under the fractured light of the chandelier. She didn't retreat from the feral intensity in Seo-Jin's eyes. Instead, she stepped into his space, her heels clicking a final, defiant note against the marble. "Remind the city," she echoed, her voice a low, dangerous velvet that matched his own. "You've spent 21 days treating me like a ghost in my own hallways, Seo-Jin. You've mastered the art of looking through me as if I were nothing more than the glass in these windows. And now you want to claim ownership?" Seo-Jin's hand shot out, not to strike, but to grip the edge of the doorframe beside her head, effectively pinning her between the exit and his towering frame. The blank mask he had worn since overhearing her phone call was gone, replaced by a raw, simmering possessiveness. "I heard you, Saphira," he hissed, his face inches from hers, the scent of his expensive cologne mixing with the sudden heat of their proximity. "I heard you tell your friend you felt trapped. I thought I was giving you the space you wanted before you inevitably asked for the divorce you're clearly dressed for tonight." Saphira felt a laugh bubble up, sharp and jagged as shattered glass. "Trapped? You idiot." She placed a steady hand against his chest, feeling the frantic, heavy thrum of his heart through the fine wool of his suit. "I'm not trapped by your world, or your name, or even the dangers that follow you. I'm trapped by this silence. I'm suffocating in the rooms you won't enter and the conversations you won't have." Her eyes searched his, fierce and unyielding. "You thought exile was protection, but it was just a different kind of cage. I didn't put this dress on for a gala, Seo-Jin. I put it on to see if there was still a man behind that monster's mask who cared enough to stop me from leaving." The tension between them vibrated like a live wire. The misunderstanding that had kept them in separate wings of the penthouse was laid bare in the foyer, stripped of its power by the sheer volume of her honesty. Saphira didn't pull away, she waited for the man who commanded an empire to realize that his greatest threat wasn't an assassin in the dark, but the distance he had created with his own hands. Seo-Jin's grip on the doorframe tightened until his knuckles turned as pale as the marble floor. The fury that had driven him across the foyer began to fracture, revealing a raw, jagged vulnerability beneath. He looked down at Saphira, his gaze tracing the defiant line of her jaw and the cold sparkle of the diamonds at her throat. For a man who ruled an empire through intimidation and calculated violence, he looked suddenly, devastatingly human. "You think I enjoy the silence?" he asked, his voice cracking with a heaviness that made Saphira's heart ache. "You think I wanted to spend 21 days listening to your footsteps in the hallway and forcing myself not to open the door?" He stepped even closer, until the tips of his polished shoes touched hers. "When I heard you tell your friend you felt trapped, it wasn't pride that made me walk away, Saphira. It was a mirror. I looked at my life, the threats from the Kims, the blood that never seems to wash off my cuffs no matter how much I pay for these suits, and I realized I was the one who had trapped you." He reached out, his fingers hovering just an inch from her cheek, hesitant to bridge the final gap. "I am a monster to the rest of this city. I spend my days negotiating with men who would kill me for a fraction of my territory, and my nights wondering if the next hit will target the woman I love because she chose to stand next to me. I thought if I pulled away, if I became a ghost in this house, you would find it easier to leave. I thought I was giving you an exit before my world finally swallowed you whole." The confession hung in the air, heavy and bittersweet. Saphira saw the exhaustion etched into the corners of his eyes, the toll of a man trying to protect a pearl by throwing it into the ocean. He wasn't avoiding her because he didn't care, he was avoiding her because he cared too much, a noble cowardice that had nearly cost them everything. "You're an idiot, Lee Seo-Jin," Saphira whispered, her hand moving from his chest to cup his face, forcing him to meet her eyes. "I didn't marry a saint. I married you. And the only thing more dangerous than your world is trying to survive it without you." The tension that had been a coiled spring between them for 3 weeks finally snapped, but not into violence. Seo-Jin let out a ragged breath, leaning his forehead against hers, the proximity of their bodies finally collapsing the distance his fear had built. The monster's mask hadn't just slipped, it had been discarded on the marble floor of the gilded mausoleum they were finally ready to leave behind. The heavy, ornate door of the master suite clicked shut, but this time, the sound didn't signal a gunshot or a separation. It was a seal, locking the rest of the world and its violent demands outside. In the dim, amber glow of the bedside lamps, the gilded mausoleum finally began to breathe again. Seo-Jin didn't let go of her, his hand remained anchored at the small of her back, his touch no longer a cold claim of ownership, but a desperate, grounding anchor. He turned her to face him in the center of the room, the midnight black silk of her gown rustling like a secret between them. The air was thick with the scent of rain from the open balcony and the salt of unspoken tears finally shed. Seo-Jin reached out, his thumbs tracing the line of her jaw with a reverence that bordered on worship. 21 days, he murmured, his forehead resting against hers. I felt every second of it like a blade. Saphira didn't answer with words. She reached up, her fingers unknotting his silk tie and letting it fall to the plush rug, a discarded banner of the war they were no longer fighting. She followed with the buttons of his blazer, peeling away the layers of the monster boss until only the man remained. When her palms met the warmth of his skin, she felt him shudder, a raw, honest reaction that no rival could ever provoke from him. He lifted her easily, as if she were the only thing of any weight in his entire empire, and settled her onto the cool silk sheets. The reconciliation was frantic at first, a hungry reclamation of everything they had almost lost to silence. Every kiss was an apology, every touch was a vow. The possessiveness was still there, simmering in the way his hands gripped her waist, but it was tempered by a newfound tenderness. He wasn't just holding his wife, he was holding his sanity. As the frantic pace slowed into a rhythmic, soul-deep connection, the walls of the penthouse seemed to shrink, becoming a true sanctuary. The Cold War was over, replaced by a heat that burned away the 3 weeks of frost. Wrapped in each other's arms, the silence was no longer a weapon used to hurt, but a velvet curtain that gave them peace. Saphira ran her fingers through his dark hair, watching the way the city lights danced in his eyes. He wasn't looking past her anymore. He was seeing her, all of her, and for the first time in nearly a month, Saphira Luxe felt like she had finally come home. Reclaiming their throne wasn't about the money or the power outside those glass walls, it was about the absolute, terrifying vulnerability of being known. And as Seo-Jin pulled her closer, whispering her name against the crook of her neck, Saphira knew the mausoleum was gone. The house was alive again. The afterglow of their reconciliation still hung heavy in the air, but the soft reprieve of the silk sheets couldn't mask the reality of the world waiting outside their door. Saphira sat up, the black silk of her gown discarded earlier now replaced by one of Seo-Jin's oversized white dress shirts. She watched him as he stood by the window, his silhouette a sharp, dark line against the glowing Seoul skyline. He looked like a king who had reclaimed his queen but was still bracing for the siege. No more ghosts, Seo-Jin, she said, her voice steady and clear, cutting through the comfortable quiet. And that means no more secrets. You said you were trying to protect me from the blood on your cuffs, but you can't protect me from a war I can't see coming. Seo-Jin turned, his expression guarded for a fleeting second before he saw the unyielding fire in her eyes. He realized then that the woman who had used a dress to shatter his silence was not looking for comfort, she was looking for a seat at the table. He moved toward the nightstand, retrieving a slim, encrypted black phone and a leather-bound tablet that contained the heartbeat of his empire. He sat on the edge of the bed, the blue light of the screens illuminating the hard angles of his face. The Kim family has been moving on our southern ports, he began, his voice dropping into the low, clinical tone of a commander. They've partnered with the Bususan Syndicate. They aren't just looking for territory anymore, they're looking for a weakness. They thought our silence was that weakness. Saphira leaned in, her shoulder brushing his as she reached for the tablet. She scrolled through the intercepted messages and the grainy surveillance photos of rival lieutenants gathered in backroom dens. She didn't flinch at the images of black sedans and hidden armories. Instead, she pointed to a discrepancy in the shipping manifests for the Incheon docks, a pattern of timing that Seo-Jin's analysts had overlooked in their focus on brute force. They aren't planning a hit on the docks, Saphira murmured, her mind racing with the strategic precision that had once made her the top of her class before she became a mafia wife. They're using the docks as a distraction. Look at the logistics here. They're aiming for the gala next week. They wanted us divided, thinking you'd be too distracted by our domestic issues to notice their movements. Seo-Jin looked at her, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his lips, a smile not for the monster, but for the partner he had finally acknowledged. He saw the way her mind worked, sharp and lethal, and realized that his greatest mistake hadn't just been the silence, but the underestimation of the woman wearing his ring. The war council had begun, and for the first time in his life, the boss didn't feel like he was fighting the world alone. The morning sun bled through the glass walls of the penthouse, no longer casting the long, lonely shadows of a mausoleum, but a bright, aggressive gold. Saphira stood before the same vanity mirror where she had plotted her rebellion only 12 hours prior. This time, she wasn't dressing for a war of silence, she was dressing for a seat at the head of the table. She slipped into a tailored charcoal suit that matched the steel in her gaze, the diamond ring on her finger catching the light with a brilliance that felt like a shield. Behind her, Seo-Jin moved with a renewed, lethal grace. He adjusted his cufflinks, his eyes meeting hers in the reflection. There was no blank mask, no cold distance, and most importantly, no fear. He walked toward her, his hands resting on her shoulders, not to hold her back, but to steady them both. He realized now that his attempt to protect her by keeping her in the dark had been his greatest tactical error. By treating her as a liability to be shielded, he had sidelined the only person capable of seeing the moves his enemies made in the dark. "The car is waiting," he murmured, his voice low and grounded. "The Kims think they're meeting a man distracted by a failing marriage. They think they're walking into a room with a boss who has lost his edge." Saphira turned in his arms, straightening his lapels with a sharp, proprietary tug. "Let them think that until we're inside the room. Silence has its uses, Seo-Jin, but only when it's used to listen to the things they think we don't know." They descended the grand staircase together, their footsteps echoing in a synchronized, powerful rhythm against the marble. The foyer no longer felt like a cage, it was a launching pad. As they reached the massive front doors, the security detail straightened, their expressions shifting from wary curiosity to immediate, rigid respect. They didn't see a boss and a ghost walking toward the black sedans. They saw a united front, a king and a queen who had traded their gilded cage for a battlefield. Seo-Jin opened the door for her, but as she stepped through, he caught her hand, leaning in to whisper against her ear. "I used to think you were the one thing that made me vulnerable, Saphira. I was wrong. You're the only thing that makes me invincible." As the heavy doors of the penthouse closed behind them, the city hummed with a new kind of tension. The mafia boss and his wife were no longer living in separate silences. They were walking into the light as the most dangerous allies the city had ever seen, ready to remind everyone exactly why that ring was stayed on her finger. The Cold War was over, and the reign of the power couple had officially begun. If this story touched your heart, please press like and share it with those you love so they too can hear this meaningful tale. Do not forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss the emotional stories we bring you every day. We sincerely thank you for staying with us until the very last moment. Wishing you and your loved ones abundant health, joyful lives, and hearts always full of love. Goodbye.